The desert was holding its breath when Nayeli Rivers, a 23-year-old native woman, staggered across its trembling sands, each step leaving a fragile imprint as if the earth feared losing her entirely. Heat shimmered in wavering sheets, and the horizon bent in a quiet haze that blurred the line between sky and land, giving the world the sleepy look of a wounded animal trying to rest. Her dress, torn from frantic running, fluttered against her legs, and her hair, long, dark, tangled by panic, clung to her damp cheeks as she whispered to no one, "Please don't leave me here," knowing the only response came from the wind that brushed past like a ghost too tired to comfort her, and still, she dared hope someone might hear her through the desert's lonely ache. She had escaped the cabin only by throwing herself through the back window when the bandits kicked through the front door, their laughter shaking the walls as they ransacked what little she owned. She ran barefoot until the soles of her feet bled. She hid beneath a dead mesquite tree when gunshots cracked like splitting wood behind her. She held her breath until her chest hurt, praying they would not look her way in the suffocating silence. But the desert gave her no shelter, no water, no mercy, only distance, and distance was her only friend now, though even that friendship felt as thin as her strength as she searched desperately for a figure on the horizon. Her knees buckled suddenly, as if the desert had finally asked for a toll she could no longer pay, and she fell into the sand, tasting dust and defeat on her tongue. Then, just as the edges of her sight began to dim, she lifted her head, and the world rearranged itself. A silhouette approached through the rippling heat, a man, tall and steady, riding a tired bay horse whose steps sent up small clouds of dust that glowed gold in the sun. She blinked, wondering if the desert had created an illusion to keep her alive for one last moment, but the silhouette did not fade, and soon the stranger's shadow fell across her like a curtain between her and death, leaving her breath caught in her throat as she realized salvation might be real. Colt Merrick, a 30-year-old cowboy with eyes shaped by years of quiet observation, reined in his horse. His gaze swept over her, her trembling hands, her bruised arms, the fear she tried to swallow for dignity's sake, and something in him shifted like an old door opening. He dismounted slowly, hands raised slightly, showing he meant no harm as he knelt beside her and offered a canteen without speaking. She stared at him with wary, glassy eyes before taking it with both hands, drinking greedily until the cool water steadied her pulse. But her voice quivered again when she lifted her head and whispered, "I'll do whatever you ask. Just don't leave me here," and the plea hollowed him in a way he wasn't ready to understand. Colt's jaw tightened, not with frustration, but with a kind of sorrow, as though her words struck somewhere he'd been keeping stitched shut for years. He gently touched her wrist to calm her shaking, encouraging her to breathe, to drink again, to believe that she wasn't alone anymore. Between sips and swallowed tears, Nayeli revealed her story in pieces. The orphaned years that shaped her, the cabin she rebuilt with her own hands, the bandits who destroyed it in moments, the running, the hiding, the loneliness that had chased her longer than the bandits ever had. Colt listened without interruption, letting the silence cradle her pain, letting her feel, maybe for the first time in a long while, that her story mattered, even as the desert wind twisted around them, carrying the scent of distant dust that hinted the danger wasn't done with her yet. When she could stand again, Colt helped her onto his horse, lifting her as though she were a sacred thing he dared not mishandle. She leaned into him, not from desire but from exhaustion, though his steady heartbeat against her back created a small warmth she tried not to acknowledge. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders. She clutched it with trembling fingers as he rode toward Haven Ridge town. The horse's slow, rhythmic gait lulled her into a daze where the world felt momentarily safe, but the way Colt's arms occasionally tightened around her made her wonder, quietly, shyly, why a stranger was treating her with more care than most people ever had. By the time they reached Haven Ridge, the sun was folding itself into the western hills, casting the town in long, copper shadows. People paused mid-stride, heads turning, whispers swirling like dust devils around their feet, as Colt rode in with the strange native woman wrapped in his coat. Eyes narrowed, lips twisted. Women exchanged glances that carried sharp judgment, and men muttered under their breath, already forming stories about who she was and what trouble she might bring. Naeli shrank instinctively, pressing against Colt's chest, wishing she could disappear into the horse's mane, but the judgment grew heavier with each step of the horse, turning the air thick with suspicion. Sheriff Boone Harlow stepped forward, his boots hitting the ground with a hard thud that broke the evening quiet. "Colt," he said, voice already brimming with disapproval, "you can't bring her here. She's trouble waiting to happen. Send her back to wherever she came from." Naeli flinched at the word trouble, as if it were a slap, and Colt felt her shiver against him. Something in him snapped, quietly, firmly, unshakably, as he slid off the horse and positioned his body slightly in front of her like a shield, saying with a slow-burning steel, "She stays with me." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The refusal itself was a storm. The town fell into a stunned hush as Colt took Naeli's hand, guiding her away from the crowd. Her fingers trembled inside his palm, but she didn't pull away. She leaned subtly toward him, as though his presence was the only thread keeping her tied to the ground. Once inside his small cabin at the edge of town, Colt lit a lamp, its glow softening the harshness of the day. He offered her his bed without hesitation and took a blanket to sleep by the door. Naeli watched him from beneath the covers, studying how the lamplight traced the angles of his face, making him look both weary and deeply human in a way she hadn't seen in a long time, and for the first time, curiosity stirred in her heart, wanting to know more about this man who defended her in a world that rarely defended anyone like her. Their connection grew in the quiet ways that matter most. Colt taught her how to grind coffee beans in the mornings. She mended his torn shirt with delicate stitches. Their fingers brushed one evening over a tin cup, lingering a moment too long before they both looked away with shy smiles. They shared stories in fragments. His about ranch life and loneliness, hers about childhood dreams and buried fears. In the firelight, Colt found himself looking at her not with pity, but with admiration for the strength carved beneath her gentleness. And Naeli felt her heartbeat soften every time he said her name, as though it deserved to be spoken carefully, yet beneath their growing closeness, rumors in town swelled like a gathering storm, threatening to drown the fragile sanctuary they were building together. The storm broke when Sheriff Boone returned with several townspeople trailing behind him like vultures. They gathered outside Colt's cabin, their faces twisted with the cruel certainty of those who believe they know best. Boone shouted for Colt to bring the stray girl out and stop harboring a problem. Naeli froze where she stood, old fear rising like a tide, whispering she should run back into the desert and disappear forever. But Colt reached her before she could move, placing both hands on her shoulders with a steadiness that silenced her trembling thoughts. Then he stepped out onto the porch, facing the sheriff with a calm fury that flickered in his eyes like lightning contained in glass. "She's not leaving," Colt said, voice low but unmovable. "She stays because I choose to protect her." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some stepped back. Others scowled. Boone's expression hardened, ready to argue, ready to condemn, ready to tear apart the small piece Naeli had found, but Colt didn't give him the chance. He turned toward the doorway, toward Naeli, toward the life he wanted to build, and something deeper than fear or pride guided his next breath. He walked to her with deliberate gentleness. "Naeli," he murmured, taking her trembling hands in his, "I don't want you to stay because you're lost. I want you to stay because you belong here, with me, if you'll have me." Her eyes widened, shimmering with disbelief, and she whispered that no man had ever wanted her for anything beyond survival or convenience. Colt shook his head, leaning forward until their foreheads touched, his voice a quiet vow carried on a fragile breath. "You deserve a life where you're chosen, not rescued, not tolerated, chosen." And Naeli felt something deep inside her, a place locked away by years of hurt, begin to open like a dawn she wasn't sure she deserved. They married under the wide branches of a cottonwood tree near the river the following day. The preacher's voice floated gently on the breeze as sunlight filtered through leaves that painted shifting patterns across their joined hands. Nayeli wore a simple dress decorated with beadwork she stitched overnight, each bead a silent prayer for a future she had never thought to hope for. Colt brushed a thumb along her cheek as he spoke his vows, promising to protect her days and honor her nights, and when they sealed their union with a tender, unhurried kiss, the world felt briefly suspended, quiet, sacred, trembling with possibility, even as a small part of Nayeli wondered whether happiness this fragile could survive the echoes of her past. Their first nights together unfolded with the slow, reverent tenderness of two souls relearning what it meant to be safe. They explored each other with soft touches and whispered breaths, moving with care, allowing trust to bloom where fear once lived. Nayeli rested her head against Colt's chest, tracing the quiet rise and fall of his breathing, while Colt memorized the shape of her laughter as though it were a map guiding him toward a place he'd never been allowed to find. They shared secrets between kisses, shared healing between embraces, and in the dim glow of lamplight, love began to settle into their bones like a gentle sunrise, though still, shadows lingered at the edges of her thoughts, reaching with familiar fingers. The past came clawing back one dusk when a traveler rode into town whispering of bandits spotted near the canyon, bandits whose description mirrored the men from Nayeli's nightmare. The news shattered something inside her. Memories of fire and shouts and tearing wood came rushing back, making her feel like the terrified girl who had run barefoot through the desert. She believed she could not burden Colt with danger tied to her name. So she packed quietly in the dark, tears falling silently onto the folded clothes she meant to take, thinking that leaving him was the only way to protect the life he had given her. But before she could slip out the door, Colt woke and found her trembling, bag in hand, eyes full of broken apology. "Nayeli," he murmured, stepping toward her with a tenderness that made her knees weaken, "love isn't something you have to earn by suffering. And it's not something you protect by running." She broke then, collapsing against him with choked sobs as he held her against his chest, one hand cradling her head, the other wrapped around her back as though shielding her from every shadow. "You're my wife," he whispered into her hair. "You stay because you belong. And I'll face whatever comes, for you, with you, beside you." As she clung to him, feeling the certainty in his heartbeat, her fear slowly melted, leaving behind a fragile but growing belief that she was worth staying for and worth loving without condition. And now, if you are listening closely, you might hear something old in this story, an ancient truth whispered through time, that sometimes salvation arrives not with thunder or miracles, but with a single person refusing to walk away from your trembling hands. If you've ever felt lost like her, or burdened like him, or judged like those town folk made them feel, remember this. There is a place in the world where you are meant to be chosen, where your grief can be met with tenderness, and where your broken pieces are not flaws but invitations for deeper love. And perhaps somewhere in your own life, someone is already reaching toward you with that quiet, unwavering devotion, waiting gently, patiently, for you to notice.